do not need leaders who see themselves as entitled, who consider national resources as an inheritance left for them by their forefathers. Agyapadie. Entry into an IMF program without comprehensive plans for the growth of the economy would have been of little value. That is also an important lesson for us in the midst of our current program. It must be recognized that an IMF program does come with conditionality that can be harsh, especially when it is addressing the realities that have been swept under the carpet for a long time. The obvious unsustainability of Ghana's debt situation, which I showed in those earlier slides, made its restructuring an inevitable part of the conditions for a bailout. As between external debts, which you saw constituted about 58%, and domestic debt, the government chose to prioritize domestic debt restructuring. Individual bondholder groups, trade unions, and the opposition NDC sought to prevail on the government to pay more attention to cutting expenditures, strengthening oversight on government finances, adopting other revenue measures so as to avoid or minimize the need for domestic restructuring. The leading IMF policy paper on debt restructuring, published in December 2021, actually recommends that countries avoid domestic debt restructuring if possible, especially because of its impact on domestic financial institutions. However, our government opted to prioritize the domestic debt exchange program. Domestic debt exchange. We don't like restructuring and all these words. Debt exchange, you know. And that choice that was made has had obvious consequences. After we were given assurances of no haircut, there were in fact substantial haircuts on investments with attendant impacts on livelihood and purchasing power. I cannot forget an encounter I had about 9 months ago with a retired public servant. He recalled with pride how he had been involved in working on the economic recovery program in the 1980s and 90s, performing his role tirelessly to help the country, and the long hours that were required during that time. He felt those hours were worth it. But having his meager pension now reduced by decisions of the government, which is the government that had plunged the country into the current crisis, he thought was not fair. He was visibly emotional at what he felt was insensitivity to the situation of people like him. This was indeed why even a former Chief Justice found it necessary to join in picketing at the Ministry of Finance in solidarity with pensioners. Local banks also suffered the impact of this debt exchange, and that impact included having the confidence of the public in them undermined. Considering that enormous resources had been expended by the government in what it referred to as a cleanup of the banking sector a few years ago, weakening those banks that you have cleaned up within a few years of the cleanup is rather strange. More especially when an IMF expert has made the case for avoiding domestic debt restructuring if possible. Of course, when you're on the outside, you don't know all the factors that led to those choices. So, in a sense, I'm raising a question which is open to discussion and to further clarification. That choice is the choice that the government made to prioritize the domestic debt restructuring or the domestic debt exchange. The negotiations with external creditors are also now close to being concluded, we are told. The new schedules for the debt repayment will form the framework of economic planning for the new government from January 2025. It must be emphasized that even after the conclusion of the debt restructuring and re-establishment of access to international capital markets, the new government will have to ensure prudent economic management with efficient and effective use of limited resources, rather than resorting to the very kind of borrowing that has led to the current crisis. That is why we must look closely at what are potentially available resources for the recovery that we are optimistically looking forward to. I want to focus a bit now on the potential in the oil and gas sector. That should not surprise you. Others are better qualified to speak more extensively about the potential in the mineral sector or the agricultural sector, for example. When I delivered a lecture in July 2022 to commemorate the passing of President Mills, I expressed concern at declining oil production. I pointed out that it was the oil and gas development projects arising from 11 discoveries made during the 3.5 years of the Mills presidency that led to the oil and gas production from the 10 and Sankofa Ginyame fields. With these two fields and the first Jubilee field in production by 2017, the levels of oil revenues escalated from that year. In that lecture, I indicated that you need a similar pipeline of appraisal to development projects so as to begin to reverse the decline in oil production. Since then, I'm afraid the decline has continued. As the 2023 report of the Public Interest and Accountability Committee states, quote, the 2023 production figure represents the fourth consecutive year of reduction of annual production volumes since 2010. The fourth consecutive year of reduction of annual production volumes. The 2023 figure was a little over 48 million barrels, having declined from a high of over 71 million 2020, that is a high in 2019 of 71 million. So 2020 saw about a 6.32 decline to almost 67 million barrels. And this decline had followed 4 consecutive years of increased production. So you have 4 years of increase and then a decline. Now, in oil industry terms, I mean, you can't just explain this in terms of, declines in, the production of different reservoirs or whatever. That is not a sufficient explanation. So, we'll come to the issues related to that in a moment. Now, with high oil prices in 2022, even though there was a significant decline in production, revenues actually exceeded the 2019 revenues. So if we look at, can we now see those the last couple of slides? Yeah. So this is from the Public Interest and Accountability Committee's